Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture on terrorism. And terrorism is something that we all know and is currently one of the biggest threats in our world today. If you click on this link here, you will see how terrorism has somewhat not just affected lives, but also changed the world that we currently live in. In today's lecture, we will be looking first at the definition of terrorism. Then we will look at different ways that we can classify terrorists. We will also examine if there is such a thing as a terrorist personality. That is, are some people more likely to become terrorists than others? And finally, we'll look at psychological factors that contribute towards terrorism. Now, as I mentioned in the first slide, or the cover slide, I said that terrorism is something that has affected all of us. It has widespread consequences. In 2014, for example, close to 20,000 people died from terrorist attacks across the world. In 2015, the number went up to almost 24,000 people. In 2015, there were about 300 cases of terrorism across the world that were reported, and these cases range from shootings to car bombing to suicide bombings. Most of these cases seem to be centered in the Middle East, South Asia, and Africa. Now, there are many different definitions of terrorism depending on who you speak to and who the definer is. One of the most widely accepted definitions of terrorism is the use of violence or intimidation to either disrupt the lives of a community or to coerce a government to act in a certain direction. It is generally differentiated from routine criminal violence as it is usually driven by a political agenda, for example, the Irish Republican Army or the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, that is the LTTE in Sri Lanka, or by a religious agenda such as the Taliban or the Abu Sayyaf. Now, this widely accepted definition is one that was proposed by Mython and Walklate in 2000. As mentioned earlier, no government policies. However, what makes a terrorist group or not is something that is debatable, as the definition of what is a terrorist group in itself varies quite widely, depending on who is defining. For example, many people consider the Hamas of Palestine terrorists, but there are also others who see them as freedom fighters or legitimate group. Let's look at Hamas in a bit more detail. Hamas was formed in the late 1987 at the beginning of the first Palestinian Intifada or uprising. Its roots are from the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, and it is supported by a robust social and political structure within the Palestinian territories. The group's charter calls for establishing an Islamic Palestinian state in place of Israel, and therefore it rejects all agreements made between the Palestinian Liberation Organization and Israel. Currently, Israel, the United States, Canada, the European Union, and Japan classify Hamas as a terrorist organization. However, other countries such as Iran, Russia, Turkey, and some other Arab nations do not. Usually, whether or not a country classifies a group as a terrorist organization or a legitimate one depends on many factors, including their political and economic ties with the organization. Therefore, the definition of what is or isn't a terrorist group or who is or isn't a terrorist is also bound by cultural factors. Now, some of the key characteristics of terrorist acts are summarized in this slide. Firstly, they usually use some form of force or violence. This often involves people getting hurt, injured, or even results in death. The aim of these acts is to instill fear within the community in the hope of furthering their own cause and in the hope of coercing individuals or groups to change their political or social positions. Another key characteristic of a terrorist act is that it usually targets a civilian population instead of the army. Terrorists can comprise of individuals acting on their own, which is what we call lone wolf terrorists, or in groups. Now, acts of terror are no longer a phenomenon that can be conveniently ignored by the masses. In fact, with extremists continually seeking weapons of mass destruction, the threat of terrorism unfortunately looms everywhere. This slide shows some pictures of the more publicized terrorist acts, including the September 11 bombings, the Boston bombings, and the London bombings. However, not all terrorist attacks receive the same amount of media attention. For example, in Katwa, Kashmir, terrorists dressed in army fatigues stormed a police station and then an army camp in the Jammu region, killing 10 people, including an army officer, in twin attacks after they sneaked in across the border. In Nairobi, Kenya, another militant group called the Al-Shabaab has claimed responsibility for the deadly attack on a Nairobi shopping center that left almost 100 people dead and others injured. Formed less than a decade ago, that is the group Al-Shabaab, they have been responsible for a string of attacks, and the group has engendered a culture of fear through pockets of Eastern Africa. Most of us have never heard of either of these terrorist attacks, although terrorism is very prevalent in both Kashmir and Kenya, and many people were injured as a result of both these acts. However, we haven't heard of it because very little international media attention actually focused on it. Often, the media focuses terrorist acts that occur in more developed nations, while those that occur in less developed nations often do not make it in the news. Why do you think that could be the case? There is no real answer for it, but it probably has to do with political agendas and who controls the media. In another case, in Palestine, 3 South Korean tourists and an Egyptian bus driver were killed in a terrorist act which was carried out with the use of remote control explosive device about 100 yards from the border of Israel. This act of terrorism was meant to serve as a symbolic reminder to Israelis that the global jihad, or what they call the global jihad, which was once relegated to corners of Somalia, Yemen, and Afghanistan, are now taking place very close to them. Closer to home, in Malaysia, Sabah specifically, there was a military standoff that lasted for more than a month, not too long ago in 2013. This incident was categorized as a terrorist attack by both the Malaysian and Filipino governments. And the Filipino government was involved because a Filipino group who called themselves the Royal Security Forces of the Sultanate of Sulu and North Borneo were the ones who tried to occupy a particular part of Sabah. Their aim was to assert that the unresolved territorial claim of the Philippines on eastern Sabah should be resolved, and therefore they wanted to take control of the area. However, the group withdrew after negotiation fails and the Malaysian army attacked. In the case of the Sabah incident, we can see that not all terrorist attacks may necessarily result in death. However, fear and intimidation is definitely a part of it. In Singapore itself, terrorism has occurred before, although we now see Singapore as a relatively peaceful state. In this table, you see 4 of the more prominent incidences that have occurred since independence. The first is the McDonald House bombing, which occurred in 1965. With this incident, a time bomb was planted at the McDonald House by Indonesian saboteurs during the period of the Indonesia-Malaysia confrontation. As a result of this bomb, 3 people were killed and at least 33 others were injured. Why did this happen? During the Indonesian confrontasi period, Indonesian saboteurs mounted a campaign of terror in Singapore. They were trained to attack military installations and public utilities. However, they failed in their attempts to attack these installations as they were heavily guarded. As they couldn't attack these installations, they instead tried to set off bombs to create panic and disrupt life on the island. This incident was relived by many recently when the Indonesian government wanted to name a warship after one of the individuals who planted the bomb. More recently, in 1991, a Singapore Airlines flight SQ117 was hijacked while in flight by 4 male passengers who claimed to be of Pakistani origin. The aircraft landed in Singapore. The hijackers actually demanded the release of members of the Pakistani People's Party from Pakistani prisons. When their demands were not met, they threatened to begin killing hostages before their deadline expired. Passengers were saved when commandos stormed the plane, killing the hijackers and freeing all hostages unhurt once the flight landed in Singapore. In 2001, 15 Jama'ah Islamiyah members were arrested after they were found to be plotting to bomb the US Embassy and a few other key installations. About 8 months later, in 2002, another 22 members were arrested for similar activities. The nature of terrorism itself is changing. Two types of terrorism seem to be more common in today's society. Firstly, religious fundamentalism, and secondly, suicide terrorism. Now, what exactly is religious fundamentalism? Fundamentalism is usually seen as a religious movement or point of view that is characterized by a return to fundamental principles with rigid adherence to these fundamental principles. It often involves intolerance of another point of view and severe opposition to secularism. Some see it as a type of military conservative religious movement that's characterized by strictly conforming to sacred texts. In today's society, religious fundamentalism is strongly associated with Islamic fundamentalism. However, it's important to note that the two are not synonymous because religious fundamentalism can occur within the context of any other religion. The other form of terrorism that seems to be reoccurring or occurring more and more frequently is suicide-based terrorism, which deploys suicide bombers. Where suicide bombers are seen as a class of suicide attack, where the bomber performs violent acts to kill others and his or herself. They're normally viewed as male political radicals, but however, since about 30 to 40 years ago, the number of female suicide attacks has been on the rise. Many organizations started using women as tools in their attacks as they're normally viewed as less of a threat than their male counterparts and are less likely to create suspicion. Therefore, the women have an element of surprise, also because they're less likely to be suspected, and many officers may be hesitant to search females. Therefore, they are more likely to be successful in their mission. In this next section, we will look at how we can classify terrorists into different categories based on their motives. Researchers and analysts have categorized terrorism into 3 main categories. Firstly, terrorist attacks as threat, where the attack is aimed to intimidate people in the society. It is not really aimed to cause any casualties, so they don't carry out the attack with the hope of hurting people. They just want to create a sense of fear. Secondly is terrorist attacks as a means, where the victim is used as a way to negotiate the goals of a terrorist group, for example, when they hold people hostage. And finally, terrorist attacks as violent as its end goal, where individuals or groups are specifically targeted to be injured or killed as part of the terrorist attack. Most terrorist groups usually stick to one category of attack, And deaths or many people being injured is most common when terrorists attacked as a threat and violence is employed. This is not surprising because when you threaten, eventually you're going to have to act on your threat to actually instill that sense of fear. And if you attack in a violent way, many people are likely to be casualties of war. The FBI uses a slightly different classification system, which is based on the political leanings of a terrorist group. The first category that they use is right-wing extremists, and these are for extremist groups that adhere to anti-government or racist ideologies. They often engage in hate crimes and violence, and their actions are usually triggered by the passing of a new law that opposes their beliefs. For example, laws on restricting gun ownership may lead to a group of people who believe very strongly in owning guns that their rights are being taken away. And therefore they feel the need to act against the government. Right-wing extremists are also the most likely to participate in paramilitary training and to learn survival skills so that they can exist on their own even within the fringes of a society. Left-wing extremists, on the other hand, are groups of people who act in the hope of promoting social change or extreme egalitarianism within a society. They are least likely to be labeled terrorist groups, but they may be considered a terrorist group when they stop protesting just verbally but start engaging in violent acts. And finally, we have special interest extremists, which comprise of radical groups that believe very strongly in a certain cause and conduct activities that revolve around these beliefs. Examples of radical groups are those who believe very strongly in the environment or protecting the environment. For example, the Earth Liberation Front, who destroyed homes, power lines, computer systems because they believe that the building of new housing, the putting out of new power lines, and the development of computer system was destroying the Earth's ecology. Finally, terrorist groups can also be categorized based on their motives. The first type of terrorist group we will look at are rationally motivated terrorists. These are groups or a group that has well-developed goals, and these goals are often well thought through and quite achievable. This terrorist group would focus on changing government or organizational goals, and they're usually driven by a sense of dissatisfaction or political dissent. And they can be viewed as promoting a revolution against an established order or regime. Terrorism is used as a means for them to demonstrate the weakness or vulnerability of a ruling regime, to show how it is weak and how their ideologies may actually be better. They often try to avoid the loss of life, and instead they focus on destroying buildings, infrastructure, or other symbolic cultural structures to create a sense of dissatisfaction or fear amongst the general public. Psychologically motivated terrorists, on the other hand, are groups who feel that they've been treated unfairly, and therefore they act to address their perceived imbalance through revenge. Individuals who feel this way are often drawn to groups which are led by very charismatic leaders who are able to build on their feelings of perceived injustice and help them feel like they belong to a particular group. This characterization is especially accurate when terrorists appear to have no logical goal or motivation that would make sense to a normal person. An example of this type of terrorism is the Oklahoma City bombing. Another type of terrorist who is also motivated by perceived injustice is the lone wolf terrorist. However, the lone wolf terrorist differs from the psychologically motivated terrorist, as the lone wolf terrorist prefers to work on his or her own. We will talk about this more in a later slide. The final category is the culturally motivated terrorists, and this group is driven by fear that their way of life, their heritage or culture is being destroyed or will be destroyed by an outsider or another group if they do not act now. They are often motivated by very strong religious beliefs, and it is most common when ethnic or religious groups fear extermination or fear loss of a sense of their common identity or culture as a result of another group coming and coexisting within their social circle. Their motivation may also be combined with political motives when they feel they are facing extreme discrimination. For example, they are being discriminated with regards to access to jobs, education, or political equality. Now, what exactly do terrorists want to achieve in the long run? The long-term goals of terrorists can be divided into four main categories or four main areas, which are fear and to create a sense of fear or uncertainty, to elicit a violent response from the target group, to reorganize existing resource allocations, or to create a false stereotype. Look at each of these in turn. Some terrorist groups want to create a sense of fear and uncertainty beyond their immediate victims. That means while they may target a certain group and a certain group may suffer either through death or injury, that targeted group may not actually be their so-called targeted victims in the long run. While this group may be hurt, the sense of fear and uncertainty they want to instill moves beyond this group, but is focused on other people who are related to members who or related to the individuals who were hurt as a direct result of the terrorist attacks. In terms of resource allocation, the terrorists may actually want their enemy, their so-called enemy in open and inverted commas, to spend a lot of resources in terms of time, energy, and money on security. Essentially, what this does is that it forces their enemy to transfer resources from productive purposes, for example, health and education, to anti-productive security measures. As a result of the reduced spending on health and education, for example, it could result in a sense of dissatisfaction among citizens within that country, and this sense of dissatisfaction could actually work to the terrorist group's advantage. Thirdly, the terrorist group may also want to elicit a violent response that will assist them in mobilizing their own people. That is, a violent counterattack to a terrorist attack that is not well aimed is actually seen as a successful thing for the terrorists. So, for example, if you think back to how Osama bin Laden and the Taliban actually attacked the World Trade Towers, what happened then is the United States and their allies actually formed a military group or got together an army to counterattack Afghanistan and its surrounding areas to actually get rid of Osama bin Laden and his followers. As a result of these attacks, many civilians were injured, and the Taliban then used the fact that many civilians were injured to gather even more support from home base to fight what they termed as the Western infidels. Finally, terrorists also hope for a reaction of stereotyping and prejudice in which terrorists are seen as typical members of the cause that they are fighting for. Often, terrorists' most dangerous opposition comes from moderates on their own side who seek alternatives other than violence. However, profiling through false stereotypes or any perceived infringements of civil rights can encourage a sense of unfair victimization, and that may be felt even by the more moderate member of their own side, and this could work to the advantage of the terrorist group. We know that the consequences of terrorism is widespread. At an individual level, it can definitely have a strong impact. Generally, the closer you are to the attack, the bigger impact a terrorist attack has on your health. For example, many survivors of the September 11th attack experience post-traumatic stress disorder and depression, and even feelings of guilt for the fact that they survived while others didn't. As a byproduct of this, certain ethnic groups were also stereotyped to be evil. For example, the Sikhs and Muslims in America, as they were closely associated with Osama bin Laden and his group. At the national level, terrorism, of course, affects the economy, where more resources are spent on rebuilding infrastructure that could have been destroyed. More resources could also be spent on security, therefore taking away funds from health and education, as mentioned earlier. At a political level, it could result in more extremist political ideologies, where more focus is put on the importance of security. At a social level, it could create feelings of distrust and mistrust amongst people who could have lived together peacefully before. And finally, of course, the more lives that are lost, the more individuals and groups are impacted as they mourn the loss of their loved one. Now, in the next section, we're going to look to see whether there is such a thing as a terrorist personality or not. We know from research that no one is born a terrorist. There is no such thing as a terrorist personality, and neither is there something called a terrorist disorder. Most terrorists, in fact, are normal people who choose to commit acts of terrorism. Of course, there will be some terrorists who are mentally unstable, but the percentage of this is actually not much higher than the percentage of people with mental or psychological disorders in the normal population. In fact, terrorists are more likely to be rational and lucid because they need to be able to follow orders and focus on their goal. Now, if you look at it from afar, it may seem that terrorists and psychopaths have a lot in common, as both groups engage in acts that create fear and cause pain, and both groups are also seen as cold-blooded criminals. However, terrorists and psychopaths are usually very different. One of the main differences between a psychopath and a terrorist is that terrorists usually do not have a history of abuse or deviant behaviors that start early in their life. Psychopaths are also usually egocentric, and they seek immediate gratification based on their own needs. These two characteristics in itself would actually make them really bad terrorists, because they would not be loyal to their organization, as they would be motivated by their own needs. A good terrorist, on the other hand, would need to be dedicated and selfless, putting the needs or goals of the organization before his or her own needs or goals. Therefore, most psychopaths are actually very, very different from terrorists. There are certain groups who are at higher risk for becoming terrorists. We know that there are some risk factors, and these risk factors are summarized on this slide. Firstly, they're usually younger, between the ages of 20 and 29 years old. They're usually male. They are also highly likely to be unmarried, because therefore they have no strong emotional bonds to a loved one or a romantic relationship with anybody. And as mentioned earlier, they also don't have any evidence of mental illness. Therefore, usually their choices are very rational in nature. So, how do you recruit somebody to become a terrorist? We know that many terrorist organizations are now choosing to recruit candidates online. Click on the link above and watch the video to learn more about how this is done. If you don't want to watch the whole video, you don't need to, but at least try and watch the video until the 5-minute and 10-second mark. So, who is likely to join a terrorist organization? Research suggests that those who are socially isolated are likely to be targeted to join terrorist organizations. And one reason for this is because when people lack the skills and strategies to modify their social situation, they feel helpless. They feel like they are unable to make change on their own, usually due to a lack of self-esteem. And then they choose to join the safe confines of a certain group. This is why individuals who lack self-esteem are more likely to join terrorist groups. For example, when interviewed, many Irish and European Union-based terrorists said they join and organize the terrorist organization in this sense to seek a sense of purpose and self-worth, as belonging to a group that's seen to have a higher cause helped them develop a better sense of self. Belonging to a terrorist group also helps to fulfill the need to belong. As mentioned earlier, many terrorists are young and attached. Many terrorists are young and unattached. Terrorist groups recruit individuals through interpersonal connections with similar others in the society. They then provide social support to the new recruit and through that develop a sense of belonging. For example, a highly committed member of a group will spend hours, even months, speaking to a recruit that has been identified as a suitable potential candidate to help them buy into the indoctrination of the group by focusing on how it relates to them as an individual, their beliefs, their goals, and even the perceived injustices that they may feel they are facing. When they feel the recruit has been sufficiently indoctrinated, they get the recruit to sign a final contract as a sign of personal commitment and loyalty to the organization. In return, the organization provides them with a sense of brotherhood and solidarity, which fulfills their need to belong to a certain group. From a psychological point of view, the motivation of terrorists can be categorized into three main areas. Based on social learning theory, for example, we know that teenagers living in areas of heavy political strife may witness direct terrorist attacks, and they may seek to imitate them, learning from their culture, which glorifies publicly these acts of terrorists, for example, by martyring the suicide bomber. If you click on the link on this slide, you will see how such acts help the individual see themselves as doing something useful not just for themselves but also their family and their larger community by joining a terrorist group or signing up as a suicide bomber. Secondly, an individual may also be motivated by his need for justice, especially if they have a very strong perception that they have been treated unjustly. And this perceived injustice could either have been targeted at themselves as an individual or their community as a whole. As mentioned earlier, they want to address this perceived injustice and therefore choose to take matters in their own hands as they feel that the system has failed them and will continue to fail them. Therefore, they feel a sense of need, a sense of responsibility to actually act, to make a change. And finally, linked to the two ideas that we presented earlier or that we spoke about earlier is the motivation to be seen as a martyr within the community that they live in. Sometimes, within the context of Islamic fundamental terrorism, it is also linked to the Islamic concept of jihad, where individuals are led to falsely believe that they are sacrificing themselves in the name of God and will therefore reap the benefits of their act in the afterlife. In the next few slides, we will look at how someone develops or becomes a terrorist. The development of the stages of committing to terrorism starts with the development of personal identity by personification of the self in an ideal image. The individual uses a rhetoric of a hero to personify himself in his ideal form. This imago or this ideal image serves as a central character in the individual's life story. and therefore the individual that they are working towards would utilize the rhetoric of a hero, where they're seen as good, simple, brave, and loyal. Usually, this growing sense of personal identity is very aligned and sympathetic to the ideals of the in group, and conversely, hostile towards the beliefs of their out group. In most cases, an individual doesn't become a terrorist. Instead, it is a gradual socialization process. It starts with indoctrination. We know that for many terrorist groups, throughout the process that leads to a suicide mission, for example, members who have a higher authority that the individual holds in high regard will continue to indoctrinate the so-called chosen suicide bomber to maintain a high level of motivation within the individual to carry out the act. This also helps to prevent the individual from changing his mind. The indoctrination themes could be nationalistic in nature, for example, the Israeli humiliation of Palestine, or religious in nature, for example, by promising them paradise through jihad within an Islamic context. Secondly, group commitment is strongly emphasized. In terms of suicide attacks, for example, the individual doubts constantly appeased and commitment towards the group constantly maximized and emphasized. At the final stage, personal commitment is considered to be sealed by asking the individual to make a video recording where the chosen suicide bomber describes his or her intention to engage in the suicide mission. He or she prepares farewell letters to friends and family that will be distributed after the attack. At this stage, the bomber is described as a living martyr and held in high regard, not just by the terrorist group but also usually by the society that he or she lives within and his or her family. The terrorist group also often promises the suicide bomber that they will take care of his or her family after the mission is successfully completed. Now, when we look at suicide bombers, are some people more likely to become suicide bombers? We know that the likelihood of somebody becoming a suicide bomber is not predicted by social dysfunction, nor is it predicted by religiosity. We also know that they don't share the same characteristics as other suicidal people. Okay, instead, suicide in an earlier slide, I mentioned a category of individual terrorists called lone wolf terrorists. We will look at them in more detail now. We know that most terrorist attacks in the US are carried out by people that we consider to be lone wolves. These individuals operate on their own, selecting their own objectives and targets. They are motivated by a sense of injustice and that they feel needs to be brought to the attention of the world. In some ways, they are a greater threat than a conventional terrorist group, as they are harder to track and predict. Gathering information on them is also harder as they operate on their own. Some of the key characteristics of the lone wolf terrorists is listed on the slide. That is, they usually operate individually and do not belong to any organized terrorist group. As they operate individually, they act without the direct influence of a leader or a hierarchy. However, having said that, they may sometimes claim to be acting on behalf of a particular interest group. Like other terrorists, their attacks are often premeditated and very carefully planned. However, they are more likely than other terrorists to be emotionally disturbed, and they often demonstrate poor interpersonal and social skills. An example of a lone wolf terrorist is Theodore Kaczynski, the Unabomber, who committed 16 mail bombings over 17 years. These acts resulted in 3 deaths and 23 injuries. He was motivated by the need to draw attention to a list of societal problems that he strongly believed to be problems, and these included technology and destruction of the environment, amongst others. He was believed to be mentally disordered or had psychological problems. However, he resisted presenting an insanity defense as he felt he was doing the right thing and that he was very rational in his thought process. In this final section, we will look at the psychological context of terrorism. As discussed earlier, the psychosocial context, for example, the context looking at the political context and economical context of a country, plays a big role in the development of terrorism. It is, after all, a construct that was created, terrorism is after all a construct that was created as a result of socialization. It is also maintained in the same way. Therefore, if we want to resolve international terrorism, we must get to the root cause of violence, as aggressive military action in itself is unlikely to make this threat disappear. Some of the cultural characteristics that are conducive to the emergence of terrorists are highlighted on this slide. Firstly, cultural devaluation. Secondly, a sense of inequality, relative deprivation and injustice, and finally, the lack of a strong respect for authority. In terms of cultural devaluation, we know that when a particular group feels that they have been selected or targeted by another group as a scapegoat, or they are being treated as the enemy, they are likely to feel that their own cultural values, their cultural beliefs and their cultural systems are being devalued, and they see the other culture as a real or tangible threat to their cultural identity. This could include the identity or the religion. Therefore, they may feel the need to fight back against the so-called outsider. Feelings of inequality or relative deprivation and injustice, perceived or real, may also motivate people to join terrorist groups, as they may feel that this is a good way for them to meet their basic needs and gain a sense of identity. In this case, the simplistic worldview of terrorists actually offer a very clear sense of collective identity that fulfills their need to belong. It also helps fill a psychological void that individuals may feel after they are perceived being treated with what they perceived of as being unfairly treated throughout their lives. The terrorist group may offer moral principles and even physical financial assistance that help people who live in difficult conditions. Finally, the strong hierarchy within a terrorist group will allow people to submit, so-called themselves, to powerful leaders and just follow their actions and be convinced of their righteousness. And this may especially be true when a group is led by a charismatic leader. Bandura has used his cognitive restructuring theory to help explain how terrorists justify their acts through cognitive restructuring. He describes this as a psychological process that involves moral justification through the use of euphemistic language and advantageous comparisons. For example, terrorist groups may convince their recruits or their new members that the actions that they are acting upon or their actions are socially worthy and are serving an ultimate moral and good purpose. Therefore, they are contributing to a higher order. Terrorist groups often also use euphemistic languages that shape or influence how an individual would think. In terms of attacks where many people may be injured or even death may occur, they may use terms such as waste instead of people, and collateral damage instead of civilians killed, as it dehumanizes their victims. They may also be very convinced that the values that they hold are superior than the values of those that they attack. They may promote the idea that the enemy is cruel and inhumane, and therefore they deserve to be attacked or deserve what they're getting. Additionally, he suggests that terrorists also distance themselves from their acts and their victims through the process of dehumanization, where it is because it is easier to mistreat others when they're stripped of human qualities. Therefore, the victims or the targeted victims are referred to as savages, monsters, and evil people, for example. It may also occur through the process of de-individuation. And what happens here is that each person in an organization performs only a small part of the larger task. Therefore, the individual may feel that they themselves are not directly responsible for the carnage that may occur later. This is possible because terrorism is often very complicated and requires many people and services. De-individuation also makes it possible for the actual leaders of the organization to only be identified by a select few. Finally, displacement of responsibility can also be a result of the process of de-individuation. For example, when terrorists see their actions as stemming from their leaders and not their own responsibility. Therefore, they can somewhat absolve themselves of responsibility by saying, "I'm only following orders." Terrorists also often have moral beliefs that help to justify their acts. In addition, they are indoctrinated by rigid beliefs where they are taught not to question or challenge. And if they do try and question or challenge their leaders, they are often punished for doing so. In a sense, they are blindly following their leaders, and their leaders also set for them clear goals which are clearly identified as contributing to a larger, more meaningful cause. For example, in helping them, in focusing on their role in helping good triumph over evil. As a result of their rigid beliefs, they often see the world in very black and white terms. For example, what is right and what is wrong. This helps them to justify themselves or their in-groups, and also helps them strongly support their belief that their acts are actually for the greater good. For example, in the long run, what they're doing will help to free society from tyrannical rule or corruption. However, for most of us, it still doesn't make it easy to justify the loss of life and suffering that terrorism actually brings about. Now, to end this lecture, I would like to again highlight that what is perceived as terrorism does differ across cultures, and many terrorists do not see themselves as evil. They do not see themselves as terrorists. In fact, they see themselves as doing what is right. And I suppose this is what makes them dangerous, because while they may have a conscience, they feel that they are acting according to their conscience, and therefore it may make it even harder to sway them from their beliefs. And this brings us to the end of today's lecture. Thank you.